This is, I just want to begin by saying thank you for having me. This is my first time in Norway. I did not know what to expect. I have to say, all of you whom I've had the chance to speak to are extremely kind and polite and interesting, and you don't remind me at all of Vikings, which is what I was a little bit worried about. Because I'd actually just seen the Viking exhibit at the British Museum last week in London, and I was a little nervous. And everything else I know about Norway comes from watching Lillehammer. So do you see is the show on here? Yeah? So, I live in New York, so I'm sensitive to how the place where we live is portrayed on TV. And so the first 5 or 6 people that I met here, I said, everything I know about here, I learned from watching Lillehammer. And I'm sure it's not at all realistic. It'd be like you watching Law and Order, some show in New York, and think that everybody's getting killed all the time, and I wouldn't want you to think that about New York. So everybody I said that to said, no, that's pretty much the way it is here. So I don't really know what to expect. I will warn you, I have no pictures, just me. That's all. I could practice my golf swing. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I have a very fond place in my heart for Norwegians generally, although in our home we don't call you Norwegians. My son, I have 2 kids, my son is now 13, and he began to read kind of young, one of those kids who starts to read on his own, and he just really liked reading. He loved Roald Dahl, but he read a lot of stuff, and like a lot of kids who learn to read on their own, they say words in their mind and then sometimes say them aloud, but they don't come out the way that we all know them as. So he once came up to me and said, "Dad, can you tell me anything about the Norwegians?" So when I look at all of you, nice, kind, non-Viking people, but you are Norwegians to me forever, not Norwegians. So what do I know about Norwegians? If you are at all like the rest of our species, which I suspect you are, I know that you're pretty honest, which is great. Modern society and modern business especially rewards honesty, which is a wonderful feature of capitalism and capital democracy and things like that. We really seek out and punish people who are dishonest, which is good. But let me run a little experiment here. Let me see by show of hands. Raise your hand if, when you use a public toilet, a public restroom, afterwards, if you do not wash your hands afterwards, okay? So let me see. Hoist them high. Let's see what we have here. All right. Okay. So I already said I think you're pretty honest. And you look to be pretty hygienic, pretty clean from what I can tell. But I know that a bunch of you, particularly the men, are lying to me now, okay? And I know you're lying because we actually have data on this very question, which is how many people say they wash their hands when they should, and how many people actually do. And these data are a little bit hard to get because you can't put cameras in a bathroom, for instance. But there are ways to get this data. So I gather some of this data myself. I travel a lot, as I'm guessing many of you do as well. I fly a lot. And often when I'll get off an airplane, and if I need to use the restroom, I will do so, and then wash my hands. And then at the sink, I'll just kind of linger for a while. I'll hang out, and I carry a notebook always, and I'll just mark down the number of men. I haven't tried it in the ladies' room yet, but the number of men who use a toilet and then wash their hands and those who don't. And it turns out that about 70% of the men who get off an airplane in just about any airport in the world I've been to will wash, and 30% don't. Okay? Now, that's why I know that probably 3 out of the 10 men here are lying to me, which is fine. But the point is this, is not to call you liars, because we all kind of lie or deceive ourselves to some degree. The point is this, if we brought the 30% of the non-washers here and sat them with their friends and colleagues and maybe bosses, they're not going to raise their hands either. The point is that the way that you gather data, the question you ask, or more broadly, the circumstances under which you gather data, will tell you a great deal about how reliable those data are. So we know this intellectually. We know that people will say one thing and do another. It's not again, that we're being dishonest or that we lie. Sometimes we just have a bad recollection of the way we do things. But the point is this. If you want to solve a problem, and really what I want to talk to you today about is problem solving. If you want to solve a problem, you need to work incredibly hard to get data that reflects the real world, that reflects what economists call revealed behavior, as opposed to what we say we do, which is declared preference. So you've got declared preference, which is how I say I will vote or spend my money or do some kind of project or when I'll finish a project, and then revealed preference, which is what you actually do. So the first rule of thumb of thinking like a freak is when you want to solve a problem, get real data, work really hard. This can be much harder than you think. A lot of us work and live in organizations where there's a lot of data being produced that is not very reliable. So just as I argue that a bunch of you are not very reliable in telling me about your hand hygiene, I would argue that you need to seek out data that's going to give you a real way to solve a problem, however you can get that data. Now, the other, Think Like a Freak, this is our third book, and in the first two, we just kind of told ridiculous stories about whatever we could get a lot of data on. So we looked at the difference in danger if you have a kid between a swimming pool and a gun. Turns out that in the US, but almost everywhere around the world, many, many more children die from backyard swimming pool accidents than from guns. Even though there are probably about 300 million guns in the US and many, many, many fewer swimming pools. So it's nice to get data to look at problems to see what we are afraid of and maybe what we shouldn't be so afraid of. Another key piece of thinking like a freak, if one chooses to do so, is we argue that we should all think like a child a bit more often. So let me explain. So kids, we like to think of children as kind of incomplete, inchoate, imperfect versions of ourselves. And you can kind of understand why that is, because there are a lot of things that we learn to do as adults that require a lot of attention that children don't have. So you don't really want children driving a car down the road because they'll be looking around at stuff or their feet can't reach the pedals. You don't want children, let's say, reading an important contract or running a nuclear reactor. Those are things that we don't really like children doing. So why are children bad at that kind of thing? One big reason is that children don't really pay attention the way adults do, okay? But if you think about what paying attention is, what we mean when we say pay attention, it really means pay attention to one thing, meaning driving or running a nuclear reactor or reading a contract. And what kids do is very, very different. So in service of encouraging all of us to think a little bit more like a kid, let me give you an example. Can you hold my notebook for 1 second? Thank you. You can look through it. There's nothing very valuable in there. So here's one thing I've learned recently about where kids are much better than us. Is anyone here a magician by any chance? No? All right. So I'm not either, but I know a bunch of magicians. And so one thing we found is that if you ask magicians whether they had a gun to their head and they had to fool an audience, meaning have their tricks really work on an audience, would they rather they perform before an audience of adults or children? And I, probably like most of you, would think, well, definitely the kids, because kids are kind of dumb and we can fool them. And adults, they're smarter and they're more experienced and so on. So as it turns out, every magician will tell you exactly the opposite. They say that if you want to fool an audience, then kids are much, much harder. So I said, why? So here's an example. So pretend that I'm a magician, again, which I'm not. I don't know the first thing about magic. But pretend I want to do this standard thing that magicians do with a handkerchief, and we've all seen this, right? And I'll say to you, okay, so here I've got a handkerchief, nice black kind of polka dots on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this handkerchief, and I'm going to move it up here for a little bit. And that's all I've done. That's all I've done, right? And now, what have you guys done? You guys have looked at the handkerchief. Why? Because you're very good at paying attention. And by paying attention, that means that I can manipulate you beautifully because I can steer you by cues into looking exactly what I want you to look at. So some kids will do that. Some kids will look at it. But then in the crowd, there's always a couple kids who will say, while I'm doing this, they'll say, oh, why is he putting his hand in his pocket and putting a plastic thumb on his real thumb? So that when I do this trick, the kids have figured it out. So astonishingly, kids are much better at what magicians call blowing up a secret than adults, because when they pay attention, they're actually kind of looking around at a whole bunch of different things, and they are not so compliant that they will follow and do exactly as I suggest that you do, and because you are good trained adults, you are very happy to do exactly what I ask you to do. So that's great if, again, you're running a nuclear power plant and you need to pay attention. But if you're trying to come up with ideas or ask questions or solve problems, then being a kid and having attention that can go all over the place can actually be incredibly good. All right, I'll take the notebook back. Thank you. So here's some of the things that children do that we kind of stop doing when we get older. Children will sit around and think about stuff that they care about and nothing else. We don't really have that luxury, but we also stop doing that. Children will come up with ideas and schemes and solutions and questions that most of us would be too embarrassed to ever float in public, at least, right? So we've all been in that meeting where, let's say there's some desperate situation at work. You have a big problem, and the boss says, all right, brainstorming session at 4 p.m., and everybody on deck, and then you get in the meeting, and the boss says, okay, there is no idea too stupid for this meeting. I just want to hear everything, right? So you've all heard that, and then you've had this idea that you've been sitting on for like a year, but you've been scared to say it. So you figure this is the time. You just said there's no idea that's too stupid. So you raise your hand and you offer this idea, and then the boss says, oh, I guess I was wrong. There are ideas that are too stupid, and that was one of them. And so what do? You will never again volunteer to ask that kind of childlike question. And that's what happens is we all kind of get that conditioned and beaten out of us, so that by the time we're here where we are now, we're conditioned that when we're asked to come up with a solution or a question, we're very good at coming up with something that we know won't get us laughed out of the room. That's why so many of the people that actually invent stuff, like you and everybody who's been talking about inventing and innovation, that's why innovation and invention does not happen so often in large groups. That's why so many of the things that we really cherish, I mean, democracy is maybe a notable example. That was a bunch of people, but a lot of it happens in really small groups, because to have the courage to fail and to have the courage to come up with those 20 ideas, most of which are terrible, but one of which might be great, it's very hard to do that if you're scared of being judged as the adult who wants to look responsible, who doesn't want to look childlike, and so on. And so I would argue that thinking like a child whenever possible is really valuable. I would also argue that, and this is going to sound very self-interested, that telling stories is a really great way to get your message across, especially if you're trying to persuade people. Okay, if you're trying to persuade, let's say you're trying to persuade someone who doesn't want to be persuaded about whatever it is, an ideological issue or a product or something. So how do you do that? So the first and scariest idea is that you should probably just quit and give up. Because people who don't want to be persuaded, people get very, very locked into their ideas and their biases and so on. And what we've learned from research over the last 3 or 4 years is really frightening, which is that the smarter you are, the more likely you are to hold an extreme view on a topic, whether that topic is climate change or gun control, whatever. So this is puzzling, because mostly we think that educated people educate themselves a lot and find out a lot about an issue and then get to a moderate position. That's kind of the promise of education. But as it turns out, that's not the way it works. What happens is that the smarter you are, the more you read and listen and watch, but smarter people are really good at seeking out stories and evidence that confirms what they already believe to be true. So you end up with a bunch of really smart people on either ends of the spectrum. So if you're trying to persuade someone, that can be really hard because they have a view, they're very confident, they're dug in, and they don't really want to hear your story. So how can you tell a story that works? How can you tell a story that will actually persuade someone? So I would offer a few ideas. One is don't pretend your argument is perfect. It is astonishing to me how, especially in the political realm, but also especially in the environmental realm, solutions are presented as all benefit and no cost. And if you know even a little bit of economics, there's just no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as a perfect solution. So acknowledge that your solution, while it has maybe a lot of benefits for a lot of people, there are going to be some people who lose out. I was talking last night with Shannon from Google about the driverless car. Do you guys follow the driverless car that's happening a little bit? So Google and every major car company in the world are working on these cars that will be totally autonomously driven, that we'll just get in and they will bring us to where we want to go. And the technology is pretty close to there. I've ridden in one at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And so if you want to make the argument that the driverless car will, let's say, save 1 million lives a year, which is very possible. There are 1.2 million traffic deaths a year worldwide right now, about 95% of which are due to human error. So as much as we think we're good at stuff, humans, we're not as good as we think. And we're not very good at driving. And computers actually will probably be a lot better. So it's quite possible that within 20 or 30 years, there will be 1 million people a year fewer dying from getting hit by cars, which is great news, right? So if that's the argument I want to make, I can pump it up, and I can tell you all the great things about it. But you, if you're dead set against the idea, you will probably be more likely to buy into my argument if I tell you that I've also thought about the downsides. If I've also thought about the fact that, in the US alone, there are 3.5 million people who earn their living by driving, including Disney buses, although you have a lot of automated trams there. So what about those 3.5 million people? What are they supposed to do? So that's a problem we'll have to solve. It's a separate problem from people getting run over, but it's a problem. What else might happen if cars are driverless? It means that drunk driving will not be a big problem anymore, which is great. For everybody who likes to go out and have fun and drink, but they have to drive. We know that drunk driving is really dangerous. And drunk walking, it's true. You are 7 times more likely to die walking a mile drunk than driving a mile drunk. So friends don't let friends walk drunk or drive drunk. But as it turns out, if we could all go out and have dinner and parties and drink and not have to worry about driving, that sounds great. But if I want to make an honest argument, I might also say that, maybe that would turn us into a world of heavy, heavy, heavy drinkers. Maybe one of the things that's keeping us from drinking too much is the fact that we have to drive. I don't know. The fact is, predicting the future is really hard. A lot of people pretend to be able to do it. They're terrible. We once did a kind of meta-study of stock pickers, political analysts, sports experts, and the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, which tries to predict corn and wheat yields and so on. And we looked at all of those experts and measured their predictive ability against, let's say, the market. And it turns out that the best and most highly paid experts in all these fields are about as good as a monkey with a dartboard, okay? Which is to say, about chance, about even chance. So predicting the future is very hard, and pretending that your solution to a problem will be perfect is kind of not a very good idea. So how do stories help? Why do stories help? I would argue that stories help for a number of reasons. They resonate with us. We identify with them. They are memorable. Stories can turn rules and theory into something that we actually process and remember. So let me give an example of this. What is, we would agree, the most famous, the most widely read book in the history of the world? What would we argue would be that book? The Bible, right? The Bible is pretty, by a factor of maybe 10 or 20, more read than anything else. Okay, so I don't know, do people read the Bible in Norway as part of the growing up? It's familiar with it to some degree? Can I just see show of hands, the Bible somewhat? Okay. What would we say is the most famous set of rules in the Bible? 10 Commandments, right? All right, so let me see somebody who has read some Bible and who has some, okay, so you, all right. So do you, how do you feel about being embarrassed publicly? You okay with that? You all right? Okay. What is your name? Sorry? Ellen. Oh, that's my wife's name. Hi. How do you spell it? Oh, yeah. You're not American or British or something, are you? You're Norwegian? What's that? German. Yeah. Hi. Okay. So Ellen, German Ellen, who's read some Bible. So very little. Do you want to? You're saying very little because you don't like to be embarrassed publicly. So maybe there's someone who likes to be embarrassed. What about the gentleman sitting next to you? You were raising your hand as well? Yeah, you're better about being embarrassed than her? Read the Bible. Oh, you've read the Bible. Are you German as well? Yeah. What is your name? Olaf. All right, let's go. You know what? We'll make it easy. I'll ask it of both of you so you can collaborate in your embarrassment, okay? Yeah. Okay, we'll pick on the Germans. So, because you picked on us. Come on, let's be honest, all right? All right. So the most read book in history, the most famous set of rules in the most famous book. So theoretically, we know them front and back, backwards and forwards, all 10 of them, like we could recite the letters of the alphabet. So Olaf and Ellen, let's hear the 10. No, that's actually not. That should be one. Don't lie. I don't think. Well, bear false witness against your neighbor. Yeah, okay. Lie. Envy, covet the neighbor's wife or husband. It should have been. Yeah. Did you say abortion? Oh, worship. Yeah. No false gods. Yeah. All right. That's good. Honor parents. Good. That no one gets that. Yeah. That's good. 4. Sorry. Stealing. Yep. Don't steal. There's a big one. Don't kill. Yeah. Good. That's like, yeah. All right. Any more? I mean, that's pretty good. That's better than average. Ellen, honestly, that's pretty good. So let me think what else. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Honor mother and father. Keep the Sabbath day holy. There are a few. But the point is this. That was actually not bad. 6 out of 10. It took a little bit. But the fact is that these are the most famous rules in the most read book in history. And even people who go to church a lot and who've read the Bible a lot don't know them. So as it turns out, there was a survey done in the U.S., and I distrust surveys like with your hand washing, but there was a survey done that said only 70% of Americans could name even one of the 10 commandments, okay? And only 17% could name more, I believe, than 5. So as it turns out, if you ask people to name all of the 10 commandments, they would do worse at that than they would at naming all 7 ingredients of a Big Mac hamburger, okay? And a Big Mac is just a hamburger versus the most famous set of rules in the history of humankind. So why is that? It's because rules and theory are hard to remember, in part because they may say some things that we don't really want to do, but just in part because they're not stories. So what do we remember from the Bible? Even if you've not read any of the Bible ever, you probably picked up some of the stories. You know something about Moses, who was this guy with a beard and a speech impediment, and something about running away, casting some plagues on the Egyptians and running away. You may know the story of King Solomon, who was considered so wise. Why was he considered wise? Because when 2 women, they were actually prostitutes, 2 prostitutes came to King Solomon with one baby, and they said they both had a baby, but one died, and now both women are claiming that the baby that's living is theirs. So what does King Solomon do? King Solomon says, I'll solve the problem. I'll slice the baby in half. That's his solution. And immediately, the one who was the real mother says, no, don't do it. Give it to the other woman. And King Solomon, being clever, says, well, I think any woman, any mother would rather see her child not hurt and give it up than see it hurt. And that's how he decided that the baby was hers. That's the stories from the Bible that we know. It may be Abraham being told to take his son Isaac and sacrifice his own son on Mount Moriah, which even though my kids are almost teenagers and I sometimes would go along with it, I mean, there's no way you could really get behind that. But the point is that stories reverberate with us. And when I say a story, I don't just mean an anecdote. Let me briefly go into the difference between an anecdote and a story. Let's say I give you a set of data, something along the lines of, I mentioned drunk driving before, okay? And I can tell you, I happen to know these numbers, that if I get in a car drunk, that I'm 13 times more likely to be involved in a fatal crash than if I'm sober. So 13 times. Huge, 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 right? So I tell you that. That's not really a story, it's just a piece of data. And then you tell me, well, my uncle's accountant goes out to the pub every night and gets really drunk and drives home and he's never had an accident. That's an anecdote. That's great. And it might even be true. But what a story is different. A story has some data in it to persuade us that it's not just one outlier. A story has a series of time so that we can see what's going on, that it's not just a blip. And a story has characters doing things, running into problems, solving them, and so on. And that's why we love stories, is because we are all narcissists at the end of the day. And that's not a bad thing. Humans are we're built to be self-interested. I don't know, built to be, but we are self-interested. And we need to be to some degree. But the fact is, when we hear a story, what we do, and the reason that we remember it, is because we place ourselves in that story. And we say, oh, I would have done it differently than that. Or I can't imagine being faced with that decision. How would I do it? And that, to me, is why stories really work. And why whatever you're trying to accomplish in your life, whether it's your business, your family, or politics, you'll learn to tell a story that's true, that's got data, that's got time, and it works, that people can identify with. All right? So just to try to prove my theory here, and I may fail, I want to tell you a story. And I've chosen today to tell you a story that is utterly ridiculous. It's a stupid, stupid story, and on top of being stupid, it's disgusting, okay? And my point is, I want to tell you a stupid and disgusting story because I think that even a stupid and disgusting story can have lessons from it that are worth hearing, okay? That's kind of my challenge, and you let me know when it's over if I've failed or succeeded. So this is a story about a kid, a college student in Japan, his nickname was Kobe. And Kobe, very lovely, nice, humble, quiet, thoughtful guy, was an economics student. And he lived with his girlfriend. Her name was Kumi. And their apartment, they had no money, basically. So their apartment was really tiny, even by Japanese standards. And they got their electricity cut off at one point, so they had to light it by candle. And they really would have liked to have some more money. And one day, Kumi heard about a contest on television where the winner would bring home the equivalent of about $5,000 US. And she thought, man, it would be really great if I could get Kobe to enter that contest and win it. And so she signed him up. She didn't tell him, but she signed him up. And when she heard that he was entered, then she told him. And he was really surprised because the contest that she had signed him up for was an eating contest, all you can eat. And it was on TV live, and it was one of these things where there were 4 stages. So the first stage, you had to eat a bunch of seafood bowls, then a bunch of noodle bowls, then a bunch of rice, and then the last one was Mongolian barbecue mutton, okay? And the way it worked is if you would eat enough at one stage, you would advance to the next, and whoever ate the most of the last one would win the equivalent of $5,000, okay? So when she told him that she signed him up for it, he was not happy and a little bit surprised because if you've ever watched an eating contest, I don't know, are there a lot of eating contests in Norway? Do you do? No? Yes? No? They seem kind of Vikingish, but again, I know you've gone well past your Viking past. So I would not suggest that you start if you don't have them. And if you have the opportunity to go to one, I would suggest maybe you don't, because it will make it hard to ever eat again. They're incredibly disgusting. And this one is on TV, where it's all close-ups and you can really see it. So Kobe looks at the way this works, and he says, well, I'm not a big guy. I'm not a professional at eating, but nobody else in this contest were professionals either. And he thought, maybe I can kind of strategize my way to do well at it. And so he begins to look at how the contest works, and he notices something very basic, which is because it's this 4 stages, as I said, what most of the people would do would, because they're amateurs, they think the only way to win is to eat so much in that first stage that they'll get to the second stage. But the problem is, even if they proceed to the 3rd or final stage, they're so exhausted and so stuffed that they don't do well. So they kind of decline the whole way. So he thought, what if at the very least I could eat just enough at each stage to qualify to move on to the next stage and then keep a lot of energy in reserve for the last stage, for the Mongolian mutton barbecue, and then eat a lot and go toward the end. So that's what he did on TV, and he won. And he won his contest. And he was through. I mean, it was $5,000. It was a really, really big deal. So now again, the other people he was competing against were amateurs. But Kobe immediately thought, if I can win $5,000 as an amateur competitive eater, maybe I should go professional. Maybe I should go pro in the sport of competitive eating. And so if you want to be a big deal in competitive eating, the biggest competition, like the World Cup or Super Bowl of competitive eating, is called the Nathan's Famous 4th of July Coney Island Hot Dog Eating Championship in New York City, okay? So I don't know if you all have seen this or heard of it, but it's been going on. It's held outdoors, like right off the beach in New York City, in Coney Island, on the 4th of July, where it's very, very, very hot and humid. So you have to picture a bunch of mostly really, really, really big guys standing up there with a big pile of pre-cooked hot dogs that are sitting in the summer sun, getting more and more disgusting as they go, and then they start chomping. And the way this contest works is it's 12 minutes long, and this had been going on for about 40 years. The world record at the time was 25 1/8 hot dogs and buns in 12 minutes. Okay? So just imagine the volume of 25 hot dogs, and then you're going to eat them in 12 minutes. Okay? So has anybody here ever eaten more than like 5 hot dogs or sausages in a whole evening for pleasure? Yeah. So you have? Was it as pleasurable as you imagined it would be, or? You had hot dogs and spaghetti together? Were you drunk as well? No, it felt very natural, actually. It felt very natural. Wow, okay. You're a better man than I, yeah. So you probably don't even need this story, so if you need a bathroom break, you're there. So Kobe decided that he wanted to try to enter this contest, where the record, like I said, was 25 1/8. And so back in Japan, with his $5,000 of winnings, he began to train, and he began to think about it, and he began to think about this problem he was trying to solve. So the first thing in his training was he needed to cook up a bunch of hot dogs and try to eat them. So he didn't have availability to regular U.S. hot dogs there, so he used these, they were sausages made of minced fish, okay? And there weren't hot dog buns, so instead he used bread that was cut down to size, and he would cook up a lot of them and start to practice. And immediately, he began to study the people who had done it before. So let me just give you the basics of the contest. You're up there, the bell rings for 12 minutes, you start to eat. The rules are eat them however you want them. You can put condiments, ketchup or mustard on if you want, but nobody who's serious is going to take time to do that. You can also drink as much of whatever beverage as you want. So most of them would use water. Some would use Gatorade or something like that. And the only other rule really was that anything that went in had to stay in, okay? If it didn't, this is called a reversal of fortune, if it comes back out, and then you would be disqualified. So those are really the only rules. So Kobe begins to study the contest, and he begins to look at the tape of the previous competitors, and what he sees is a bunch of mostly really, really big guys who usually would fast for 3 days beforehand to try to get themselves really hungry, and then they would be up there and the bell would ring and they'd attack the hot dogs and pick them up and eat them fast, 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 kind of maybe like you, and then swallow one and then just drink a bunch of water to wash it down, chew as quickly as they could, and then do it over and over again. So basically what Kobe realized is the way the best champions in the world did it, their hot dog eating, was essentially the way that we would do our everyday eating, but faster. So he thought, that might be the best way to do it, but maybe it's not the best way to do it. Maybe I should try some experiments and try something different. So he decided to experiment. The first thing he did, which proved really great, is rather than picking up a hot dog, he had this very basic thought, which is, I have hands and I have a mouth. That's all I've got, okay? If I feed the hot dog into my mouth, like everybody else does, my mouth is doing all the work. What if I decide to just break the hot dog in half with my hands? then I'm doing at least a little bit of the work that my mouth would otherwise be doing. So he started by picking up a dog, breaking it in half. This maneuver, by the way, came to be known as the Solomon method, after King Solomon in the Bible, who threatened to cut the baby in 2 pieces, okay? So Kobe does the Solomon, and now he starts feeding himself with 2 hands. And then he immediately notices something about this, which is that when you are eating like a sausage or a hot dog for fun, the meat and the bread go together nice. They complement each other nicely, because one is salty and dense and slick, and the other is big and light and airy, and they balance each other out beautifully. But when you're trying to eat not for pleasure but for speed, what you have is what he called a density conflict, right? Dense, very, very dense and very, very airy. And to try to chew them at the same time is a kind of multitasking that the mouth isn't very good at. So he thought, what if I take and break the dog, King Solomon, and then separate the dog from the bun? So now he's got 2 halves of a bunless dog in one hand and 2 halves of a dogless bun in the other hand. So he's just playing, he's trying all these different things, and he starts to chew. Now, you would think that the hot dog part is the hard part to eat and swallow. As it turns out, right, it's not, because it is so slick and dense. So, you know, if you go to the zoo or the aquarium, or maybe you just do it out here in your water, you see them feeding dolphins, and they feed them herring or whatever. And you know how a herring, you know, the dolphins will just look up and they'll put the herring in it, and the dolphins don't like chew, they kind of slurp it down. So that's what Kobe found that he could do with a hot dog without the bun, is you can kind of just slurp it down. You need to chew a little bit, but not that much. It would go down really easily. The bun, however, was a different story, and the bun was really hard. So here, I'll give you, if you ever want to win a bar bet, here's what you do. You take a bunch of hot dog buns into a bar, which is fun just in and of itself, and then you put down 2 buns on the bar and say to somebody, I bet you can't eat those 2 buns in 1 minute without a drink. And everybody will take the bet, and they'll eat one pretty easily, but by the second one, they're almost, you can kill somebody, so don't kill somebody, but you will win the bet. If they're alive, they'll pay the bet. Because it's really hard to eat the bun because your mouth gets very, very dried out. So Kobe tried that. It was very hard. But then he thought, wait a minute, I can have as much of whatever beverage as I want. What if I take my bun and soak it in water? So he began to do this, and he began to experiment with different, water, juice, different temperatures of water. And what he found was the best is you break the dog, separate dog and buns, slurp, slurp, slurp. And while you're doing that, you would soak your buns in warm water, okay? Warm was great because it broke down the bun pretty quickly. Hot broke it down too quickly. Also, hot was bad on the throat. Cold was bad on the throat. But soaking your buns in warm water would break down the bun a little bit. Then you take it, smush out the excess water, then you pop it in your mouth kind of like a bun ball. It would go down really easily. Plus, now you don't have to take time later to drink because you're already getting your liquid. So like everything he does is getting a little bit more efficient every time. He's videotaping his every training session. He's gathering data on speed, what his pace should be, and so on. And then he finally goes to New York to compete for the first time. And he gets to Coney Island, and everybody looks at him, and he's this little guy, and they think that he's just a friend of some other competitor. And then he gets up to the tray, and the bell rings, and he goes, and he does great. And in his very first contest ever eating actual hot dogs in a contest, he won, his very first time out. But he didn't just win, he set a new world record. And he didn't just set a new world record by a little. I told you the old record was 25 1/8. He ate 50 hot dogs and buns in 12 minutes. It was nuts. It was crazy. He would go on to win it 5 more times in a row, ultimately getting up to now he eats 70 hot dogs and buns in 10 minutes, okay? So after he won that first time, immediately people were very suspicious and thought he was cheating somehow. So there were charges that he was doping, that he was maybe taking a muscle relaxant, which is not true. You also have to keep in mind, this is 4th of July, U.S. Independence Day. Hot dogs are our big national food. And here was this Japanese guy, and we haven't quite gotten over Pearl Harbor. And so there were some people who charged that he was a government plot to embarrass America, and that Japanese surgeons had surgically implanted a second esophagus and stomach in him. None of which was true. None of which was true. What was true, the fact is, no one doubles a world record ever. okay? And so if you want to look at someone who does something so much better than everybody else, you have to ask, what did he do? How did he do it? So what did he do? Well, as I described, he changed his strategy entirely. So I think in describing what we can learn from Kobayashi, I think there are three lessons, three takeaways. The first one is what he really did is he redefined the problem that he was trying to solve. Now again, eating hot dogs is a ridiculous problem to try to solve. We are presumably all involved in things that are much more important or will help other people and so on. But I think the lesson here is very applicable, which is this. He looked at the problem he was trying to solve and said, what is everybody else doing? So imagine I'm trying to solve poverty or famine or whatever. What is everybody else doing? And then he said, I'm not sure they're asking the right question. The question all the other competitors were asking was, how can I make myself hungry enough to eat a lot of hot dogs? Or how can I get a lot of hot dogs in my stomach? And Kobe asked a very different question and therefore got a very different set of solutions, which is, how can I make one hot dog faster to eat? And by asking a different question, he came up with a set of solutions that were entirely different and which literally changed the sport to where now the guys who used to eat 15 and 20, they now are routinely eating 40 and 50. Okay, so one is redefine the problem you're trying to solve or ask maybe a better question. Number two that Kobe did that I love has to do with limits, the limits that we accept and why we accept them. So when I first started to talk to Kobe years ago about this, I asked him, did you think that you could break the world record the first time out? And he said, I did not allow that number to enter my brain at all, that 25 and an eighth number. And I said, well, that's weird. It was the world record. Why not? He said, well, because I was convinced that everybody who came before me was asking the wrong question and trying to solve the problem wrong. And I did not want to give any mental legitimacy to that barrier because I thought it was an artificial barrier. So I was blown away by this. I think that all of us, every day, face all kinds of barriers: time, money, expectations about how good we can be or how much we can deviate from what's been done before. And many of those barriers are real, and many of them are not. Many of them are artificial ones that we've accepted. And I would argue that whenever possible, seek out the barriers that you have in your life or business, figure out if they're real or if, like for Kobe, they were something that mentally, once you put it in your mind, you'll accept, but they're not so real and you can bust through it. Would he have broken the world record if he had acknowledged the legitimacy of that barrier? Maybe he would have eaten 28 or 30, but it's hard to imagine he would have gotten 50 if he'd really thought that 25 was an upper bound. So redefine the problem, number one. Number two, refuse to accept or seek out and bust through artificial barriers. And the third key lesson that I think we can all draw from Kobe, even if we don't have any desire to be a competitive eater, and one that you, especially living in a climate like this, should do whenever possible and for as long as possible, you too should soak your buns in warm water, okay? Now, I just want to say one more thing, which is probably a terrible idea to say. And I have 1 minute and 40 seconds left, which is perfect, because if I go on past that, it would be bad. It'd be terrible. So everyone is here because they're trying to solve a problem or make some improvements or answer some questions or get a little bit better at what they're doing. And that's great, okay? We are the only species that kind of operates like that. And we've accomplished amazing things. But there's also a part of our thinking that I want to encourage you to consider getting rid of. And that part of the thinking is how hard we work and how long we stick with something, even when it's not working, okay? So, Winston Churchill famously said in, I guess, maybe October of 1941, he went back to his boarding school at Harrow outside of London, and he told the kids, the boys who were going to school there, he said, never, 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 never give up in anything great or small, large or petty. The US version of it, we have a football coach, Vince Lombardi, who said, a winner never quits and a quitter never wins. And so we've adopted this idea that quitting is kind of a moral failure and that failing itself is always a loss. And I just want to say, I want to encourage all of us to look at the upside of quitting. And what I mean by that is this. If you look at through the lens of economics, you'll see there are two things to consider. One is what's called the sunk cost fallacy. When you've sunk a lot of cost into something, it's whether it's time or money or energy or whatever, it's natural to assume that the only good thing to do is keep investing. The fallacy is it's often not. And so we keep doing it even though it can be counterproductive. The other part to look at is what economists call opportunity cost, which is to say, for every dollar or hour or idea or brain cell that I'm spending here, I'm sacrificing the opportunity to spend it there on something that might be better. And so while it's very admirable and honorable and maybe even natural for all of us to want to stick it out, whatever the it is, it might be a project, it might be a relationship, it might be a job. If we think about the upside of quitting, often you'll gain some clarity, because the fact is, you can't solve tomorrow's problem if you're not willing to abandon today's dud. And it's very hard for us to tell ourselves that this is a dud. And it's very hard for us to look at failure as something other than negative. But I would invite us all to, rather than fear and tolerate failure, to celebrate failure. And rather than see quitting as a moral failure, to see the upside of quitting. And so, with my final breaths, at least final breaths here, I hope I don't die immediately. That would be a great ending, wouldn't it, Doug? That would make the newspapers for sure. With my final breaths on this stage, I would just encourage you to do probably the opposite of what a lot of people much smarter than I who've been on this stage would tell you. And I would tell you to go home today, or maybe right now, or maybe next month. Find something that you're doing that's not working, that's not optimal, that you've sunk a lot of cost into it, and go out there and quit something. Hopefully it's a bad thing you quit, not a marriage that's been fantastic and so on, and I don't want responsibility for that. But go out there and quit, people, okay? And with that, I quit you, and I thank you very, very much for having me today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really great, really great.